It's nearly Thursday, another end of the week looming in front of us. Jazakallah khair, everyone who's watching live and everyone who switches on to the recording afterwards as well, to listen into the recording after the show as well. At the moment, I think many of you might be aware, many of you might be hearing about all the different updates, different things that are happening across the world. They are being highlighted in every media community. It's been highlighted by every news channel. It's been highlighted by so many different outlets of news and information that is being shared about globally. And obviously, the dominant topic is coronavirus and where we are in terms of the fight against the coronavirus, or where the kind of the next phase of any lockdown restrictions or traveling or anything else will basically come up. And I think the general trend, as many of you might have been noticing for the last many weeks, especially in UK, to a certain degree in US and across Europe as well, is that things are opening up again. Germany is probably, and Sweden is probably the most advanced, the two of the most advanced countries in terms of their easing down of lockdown restrictions that we've had during the coronavirus situation. And it seems to be that normality is basically returning in Germany and Switzerland, Switzerland, and Nordic countries, including Sweden, quite a certain degree. In UK, I think things are probably progressing, albeit at a slower pace, but still they are easing down of restrictions, and there are further openings of all the different national parks. The majority of the kind of open air spaces have been reopened, and apart from a very specific segment of shops where there's a high human touch contact element, like saloons and barbers, hairdressers, and all those sort of things, apart from that, I think many of the other shops and offices have been in a way reopened pretty much. Public transport, obviously, I think that's functioning quite properly. And again, few of the restrictions are in place that you need to be wearing a mask and you need to be distant from the other people. But apart from that, generally, the things are to a certain degree on a normal scale. Schools, as I mentioned, I think last time around, both secondary and primary schools in UK have been reopened as well to a certain degree. Again, it is a bit optional at the moment if you want to have your kids back in the school. But it is progressing. Same as airports. I think we saw airlines such as EasyJet starting to operate their flights again. The functions of all their flight operations have been restarted to a certain degree. Still, at least not to the full capacity as it was before the pandemic, but obviously the flights have been restarted into certain areas. There are rules on social distancing. They are getting 1 seat apart reservations, for example, for people to fly in. But still, it is moving on, and it seems to be opening up. Emirates have opened up their operations globally, as you might have heard. Qatar Airways have opened it up. Etihad Airways have opened it up. Singapore Airlines have started admitting people back into Singapore as well. They have to go into a quarantine, but that's still open. In America, things have been progressing as well. And I think probably since the start of the pandemic, today was pretty much the first diplomatic engagement on a higher level as well. And when the French president traveled into London this morning, and he met Boris Johnson, and they were socially distant. Many of you might have seen the news stories and the photos. They were both 2 meters apart, no handshakes, nothing, just conversations from far. But again, French president traveling for the first time after the pandemic is a bit of a sign that things are moving on, and it kind of it seems to be that things will get back to normal to a certain degree. Apart from that, I think in the UK, the big Brexit debate is picking up again. Many of you might be aware that 31st of July was the deadline to find a deal. 31st of January was the date that Britain actually left the European Union. And 31st of July was set up as the date when there needs to be a decision about any agreement or a deal, as it known, between European Union and the United Kingdom on the exit of UK from the European Union. If there isn't any deal reached by 31st of July, then it will be what they are calling it as a hard Brexit, that everything will turn back to the WTO agreements on trade. To a certain degree, there's this noise about visas and traveling restrictions and all that sort of stuff. So it's looming now. I think that's one of the reasons why the French president was here probably this morning to discuss about how they are going to tackle the Brexit scenario and everything else shaping up in that way. Apart from that, I think globally, again, just as I'm asked to just keep an overview of the global things that are happening. I think in the African continent, the coronavirus is slightly stable as such, that there isn't a huge rise in numbers. It seems to be that it is a bit controllable in certain areas, but there are still restrictions in place. I was speaking to people in South Africa this morning, and it still seems to be that they are not really allowed to go out to the beaches. They're not allowed to be openly mingling and meeting as it was before. And I think on the Northern Africa side, in Libya, the situation seems to be worsening a bit, with all the different factions engaged in a very lengthy civil war since the end of the Gaddafi regime. And at the moment, I think the forces aligned to a certain degree with the interests of Turkey are actually making a lot of progress, and there seems to be the dominant force across the regions in Libya. And I think that you might have seen it became a major flashpoint last week between Turkey and Greece, as well as some of the equipment carrying ships from Turkey were carrying or traveling into Libya. And they were stopped into the international waters by the Navy of one of the European Union countries. And it nearly got to firing exchanges and a proper blowout between the two navies, but it was avoided at the last minute with the both ships and the carriers changing directions. So things are happening. Things are still kind of progressing on that end. We know in the South Asian scenario, I think the big story is obviously the Chinese and the Indian conflict that has been happening in Ladakh. It is a growing escalation at the moment. I think it's been ongoing for a few months now, since it is again one of the disputed territories between China and India. And there seems to be some confusions on who's owning the territory, what the infrastructure buildup was. And it seems like that some of the reports coming out is that actually it got to a physical jostling between the two nations. And many of the people who died actually were falling off the cliffs, because we know that it is a very high altitude area. And many of the soldiers that have been reported missing or dead were actually dropped off from the cliffs during the fist fight. Many of them lost their lives falling into the rivers in the valley. So that's again one key conflict. 20 soldiers, including a colonel, I think was reported by India that they passed away and they died during this battle in the conflict without any firing exchange. That's the other phenomenal thing. Not a single fire or mortar was fired. It was actually just a physical fight. And again, as I mentioned, because of the location, many people actually fell off and they lost their lives in that manner, which added up to 20, and they still reported 17 more missing people and in that domain. So it is, I think, a mixture of different events and things happening globally. And again, I think I was reading some of the recent reports, thought leadership, ideas being shared on the web around by different leaders in different domains. And there seems to be a crying need that everyone is feeling that this can be a turning point for how the future of the world shapes up. It can be different in the way the digital economy of the world will work. It will be very different in the way people will travel for the rest of the world. And it is interesting, I think, if you compare the shock to the global economic systems and the global markets, it's been more severe than anything ever happening before. Like the 2008 financial crisis, or the recession, as it was known back in there, is pretty much highlighted on a daily basis. But this shock to the global economy is even worse than that recession. I think even today, many of you might have heard that even places like Bank of England, they announced that they will continue with their bond buying scheme that is known as the quantitative easing, as many of you might be aware of it, of £100 billion that they are actually going out and they are buying company shares basically just to ensure that the companies do not fall over and the stock market doesn't crash. And £100 billion being invested into many different companies, it is in essence the death of capitalism, if you want to call it this way, because nearly everything is nationalized. If you even imagine big private companies, they've been given public money by the governments to remain and sustain their businesses. They are part nationalized. So the whole concept of capitalism versus communism is back into major discussion at the moment, because we know in places like in the previous Soviet Union and the current Chinese states, every infrastructure institution is owned by the government. So you don't have private electricity companies, you don't have private rail companies, you don't have private any other suppliers of infrastructure, for example. In UK, it's completely opposite. You have private airlines, Virgin, private train companies like Virgin and National Rail and all those sort of things, Great Western and all the other things. Private utility providers, you can have different water providers to your house, you can have different electricity and gas providers. It doesn't happen in China because every company is owned by the state. It seems to be that UK is, and globally other countries as well, they are actually moving in a similar direction because all the private companies are now part owned by a state as well. TfL was privatized. Many of you might be aware of it, Transport for London, but the government has now given 2 billion nearly to TfL to sustain their business, and now they pretty much own TfL as a nationalized unit more than anything else. So again, I think it is interesting how the economic shock in the markets is reflected in the real life, in the real economies, and how things are shaping up for the future. But the agreement, as I was mentioning, is everyone is agreeing on a single point that there will be so many changes that are going to come through in the global economy, in the way we work, in the way we travel to work, in the property prices, in the way people are investing at the moment, in the way people are living into cities. This structure will change to a certain degree, depending on how the rest of the pandemic situation basically grows in. In terms of any kind of drugs or anything else that's been discovered for coronavirus so far, I think there's a major research published by University of Oxford. They are developing a vaccine at the moment. It has been tested, it's been through some clinical trials, and it's been successful to a certain degree. And as I mentioned, I think AstraZeneca, one of the largest manufacturers in the world of pharmaceuticals and medicine, has already agreed a deal with University of Oxford that if it is regulated and goes through all the trials and it is approved for human consumption, they would be the first ones to buy it and create and kind of start manufacturing it on mass, on a mass scale. So that is progressing. I think there's on another. Again, you might have seen across news that there is another steroid that has been utilized in treating many of the coronavirus patients. It seems to be successful to a certain degree, that it has decreased to a certain degree the rate of mortality in the people that the steroid was tested against. And it seems to be something that is potentially working at this stage. So hopefully, again, if it is something that becomes successful, it will be rolled out more globally. And at least to a certain degree of prevention, if the steroid is working on a larger swath of population, then we'll see it being utilized more globally. So that again is slightly good sign that things are going to be moving on. And I think other than that, many of you might be aware again as the global situation around markets is changing. It's going to be an election year in US that is going to change the president in US. Hopefully, don't know, but Trump might win it again. And most likely his opponent will be Joe Biden now, the vice president with Barack Obama, because he's pretty much won all the primaries across the Democrats and the internal elections of the Democratic Party. So I think it should be interesting that things the way they are at the moment and how they are progressing for the future might be slightly different to the way we know of them at the moment. And more or less, I think the other elements keeping kind of people talking globally is the role of technology in supply chains, the role of technology in our daily lives. it is interesting. You might be aware of the Zoom app that is very common and very popular. Nearly all the schools globally are operated via Zoom at the moment. And the inventor or the owner of Zoom actually wanted to start it in Silicon Valley. He wanted to travel to US, but he was rejected a visa. And now globally, Zoom is the app that is being used. It has been kind of some security flaws has been raised about it, some issues about privacy, but it seems to be still the dominant technology that globally it is used. I think the two major platforms that have probably benefited the most during the pandemic has been the Microsoft Teams platform. That saw it originally had about 8 million users globally, and it shot up to 120 million users in the next 3 months since March, April, May now. And second is Zoom. I think nearly every single company, every single person might have heard about Zoom in the recent days. So everywhere that there is a good digital connection, Zoom seems to be the most popular one being utilized at the moment. So we'll see how technology shapes up. We'll see how different companies react to technologies. You might have seen already so much restructuring going on. I think major companies and banks, BP, for example, British Petroleum announced 10,000 people that they are going to cut from the staff. HSBC has announced up to 35,000 people that are going to be cut down from their staff. Deutsche Börse, one of the Deutsche Bank, actually, the major German bank, cut down 20,000 people across their global staff. So there are going to be a number of issues that the business are going to face over the years. But it is going to be a fascinating kind of assortment of how people are tackling beyond this pandemic. What are the impacts on the economic scale, on their daily lives, on their moral and spiritual well-being, and their mental health, and how they are going to come out of this pandemic on the other side. And I think that this is why, as I always mention, that whenever we speak about, and you must have heard the panel discussion we had yesterday about the concept of worship, and brothers were mentioning, Brother Sultan, Usman, Nubeen Bhai, Farzan, Nizam Bhai came on, and they were discussing this concept that the kind of the whole focal point of any Muslim is to remain connected within the whole world and still remain connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well, and really understand from that perspective of what are the external forces impacting the internal iman of any person, any faith-based person, any person who have any faith, and how that faith really provides the guidance to define what is happening in the external world rather than the other way around. So inshallah, we'll continue with our discussion. Nizam Bhai, he probably might be waiting, just speak again and again for a very long time. So Nizam Bhai, mashallah, presents the daily tafsir. Nizam Bhai, assalamu alaikum.
वालेकुम अस्सलाम रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातहू।
कैसे हैं, ठीक ठाक हैं?
अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह।
अल्लाह का शुक्र है। आपका घर से ही काम जारी है आजकल अभी?
जी जी ऑफिशियली अनाउंस तक अब देखते हैं
तो क्या आप लोगों को क्या एक्सपेक्टेशन है? कुछ बता रहे हैं आपके ऑफिस वाले के वापसी का, या
नेक्स्ट मंथ का जो सेटअप है वो स्टिल इन